Hello, everyone. This is the 194th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I interview Mr. Brian D. Bunk, revisiting his book From Football to Soccer: The Early History of the Beautiful Game in the United States, published in 2021. Mr. Bunk is a senior lecturer in the history department at the University of Massachusetts. He is also the author of the following books: Ghosts of Passion, Martyrdom, Gender and the Origins of the Spanish Civil War, and the co-editor of Nation and Conflict in Modern Spain, Essays in Honor of Stanley G. Payne. And most recently, I believe it came out, this book, right? Beyond the Field: How Soccer Built Community in the United States. That came out this month, I believe. Right.
That's right.
So, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thanks for asking me to come along and talk about my work.
Thank you. Can you introduce yourself and your trajectory into football?
I mean, as you indicated, I teach in the history department at UMass Amherst. I started out as probably as a parent with the first book as a historian of modern Spain. And I think studying European history, I think probably introduced me to soccer or made me a fan of the sport. When I was growing up, I grew up in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and soccer was not necessarily something that was on my radar very much, in the 1970s and 80s. But again, once I became interested in European history, soccer sort of it drew my interest. The 1990 World Cup, I was in Europe during that, and that was just an amazing. I'll never forget that opening match of Argentina and Cameroon. It was incredibly exciting, and I think that maybe more than anything kind of turned me on to soccer. But as I said, I never really played at any level other than on a graduate school team. So I wrote my first book on modern Spain, and then I was looking for another research topic, and I became interested in the Spanish immigrant community in New York City, and especially a boxer, a Spanish heavyweight boxer in the 1920s and 30s, who was one of the main contenders. And so I was researching that community, and I was especially looking for information about boxing. I discovered that they had published a sports newspaper in Spanish in New York City, and so I was looking through copies of that, and I kept having to page through stories about soccer and the soccer league that was formed in New York in the 1920s. That was the Spanish American Soccer League. And gradually it dawned on me that maybe there was something to soccer in New York and the Spanish community there, along with there were Portuguese teams and some Latin American or South American teams as well in the league, but most of them were Spanish. And so I thought, okay, I'll start researching soccer. So I'll look at what are the books on US soccer history. And I quickly discovered that there really weren't that many books or academic articles written on the history of soccer in the United States. I did eventually come across Roger Alloway's work, of course, and some other things, but largely there was not anything written. So that made me focus more intently on the broader history of soccer in the United States, branching out from the Spanish community in New York and looking around a lot more. And so that's kind of where I got the start, and where I guess in some ways the genesis of the book came from, is trying to write a well-researched history that explored especially the early origins of the game, because I didn't think that anything like that had really been written or was accessible to people.
The early establishment of the game in the United States is seldom discussed, and I don't think there are too many books on the subject. Your book itself is a massive academic analysis with sections on notes and bibliography as large as entire chapters. Can you, yeah, so can you discuss the format of your book and the duration to write such a comprehensive book?
Yeah, I mean, I'm an academic historian, and so that's kind of what we do is write academic monographs, they're usually called. And so I did try to make it a bit more accessible than the average scholarly work. But you're absolutely right. There's a lot of footnotes and a long bibliography. In my defense, I think part of the reason there's so many footnotes is that a lot of the sources come from newspapers, and there's just probably dozens, or I probably read thousands of newspaper articles or stories in digitized newspapers to write the book. So a lot of that stuff, means there's a lot of notes. The new book, Beyond the Field, is much more of an accessible, it's more of a narrative history. So there's not as much academic analysis in the new book. It's more about telling the stories about these different communities. So, I mean, that's kind of, as an academic and a professional historian, I guess my first thought was to write a book kind of in that space, as it were. And then my next book, which is Beyond the Field, is trying to branch out and make it more accessible to a broader readership.
Most of the research process, it would be fair to say it's mostly old newspapers.
Probably, yeah, I would say a lot of the primary sources. I mean, as historians, we use primary sources, which are things generally from the time period that we're studying. And then secondary sources usually are the work of other scholars. And so, yeah, I would say probably the vast majority of the primary sources are newspapers. There are other sources, including the Spalding Guides, which were produced by the U.S. Soccer Federation nearly every year from I think 1906 to 1923. There's a couple of years missing. And so, or those contain usually summaries of different seasons in different places, but it can be kind of hit and miss, I guess, depending on someone, whether someone from San Francisco bothered to write a report and send it to them. Otherwise, it might not. It might appear in one year and then it might disappear for 2 years and then come back. But that had a lot of really useful information, especially for the chapter on Pittsburgh, for example, the chapter on Western Massachusetts. So those were the primary sources that I used apart from newspapers. There are no clubs that have survived. We don't have a lot of documentation. Like if you were studying the early history of the game in almost any other country, in England, for instance, Arsenal Football Club, or those teams have been around for, since the end of the 19th century. And so they have their own archives. Again, sometimes they're hit and miss, but obviously we don't have anything like that in this country because there are no legacy clubs that were formed in 1898 and still exist in some way today. So there's not a lot of institutional records, unfortunately. One of the dreams, if I had a dream, find the American Soccer League in 1920, formed in 1921. And as far as I know, none of those, or very few of those records have survived. And that would be kind of a dream archival find, is the records of the American Soccer League in the 1920s.
In presenting the evolution of the game, you go as far back as the indigenous population as well as the early settlers. Can you explain why this was critical in the later development of the game?
I kind of wanted to show the evolution of the game and not necessarily just make an arbitrary distinction like, okay, here's when soccer begins, and rather to kind of indicate that it's a process out of which these games developed. And so while we can't necessarily say the Native American games had any kind of impact on the development of soccer, but it's just part of the history of these types of sports, football in a more generic sense that existed in the United States before the writing of the association rules in 1863, and how it was more of a kind of gradual sets of developments rather than pointing to one time period and saying, this is when soccer began. So I just wanted to sort of show that there is a sort of continuity of play that existed from, very early on in North America and continuing up until the 1920s, and that the game changes, but in some ways it's all part of this kind of historical, all part of this history of these kicking or football games in North America.
In your conclusion chapter, you mentioned three developments that helped the growth of the game: urbanization, industrialization, and immigration. Can you explain this further?
Sure. I mean, I think this is true in not only in the United States, but probably in countries all around the world, that you have movement to the cities. As the process of industrialization begins, there is more and more of a need for labor to work in places like textile mills in Fall River, Massachusetts, or paper mills in Holyoke, Massachusetts, or in St. Louis. It's repeated all over the United States. So people came from outside of urban areas to those places, native-born Americans. Also, the end of the 19th century is a time of great immigration, especially from Europe to the United States. So you have English immigrants, you have Scottish immigrants, you have Italians and Germans. You have this enormous influx of people, and they brought their traditions and their games and their interests with them, and they helped to form these different communities in cities around the country.
As we reach the mid 19th century, you make comparisons between baseball and this early type of football, which is a hybrid of gridiron football and rugby and soccer in some ways. Can you touch up on the contrasts that led to the evolution in each?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big differences is that, well, there's a few, I guess, factors I think at play. One, which I think a lot of people know about, is that soccer had a reputation as being a foreign game, whereas baseball kind of presented itself as being the American pastime or the national pastime. So oftentimes immigrants might come from Italy or from Ireland and they might start to take up baseball as part of this process of assimilation. So I think that is one factor. I think another factor, as I talk about in the book, is that gambling was an important pastime, and baseball is kind of made for gambling with all of its different, it's sort of slow. The statistics are easy to track. You can do what we call propositional betting, whether someone will get a hit or someone will hit a home run or someone will score a certain number, a team will score a certain number of runs. Whereas football, as it was played at the time, is not as easily bettable, I guess. Teams had individual players were not necessarily known. Goals tended to be kind of unusual or rare events. Teams, there wasn't quite as much of an organized team structure as there was in baseball. So betting was really not as big of a pastime in terms of football or early soccer. Teams would usually or sometimes would bet on the outcome of a game, either a monetary bet or sometimes they would bet like who's going to pay for dinner. But it didn't have the depth, I guess we could say, of gambling available to it. So I think that's part of it. Baseball, of course, quickly becomes kind of professionalized by the 1850s and 60s. And that obviously it takes a much longer time until the 1890s before the first professional soccer leagues are formed in the United States.
You
Right.
point out that baseball becomes codified first, so
Mhm.
that's their advantage in
Yeah.
terms of the growth. Yeah.
Yeah. I also think that baseball and football were originally games played by children, especially young men. And then sort of football continued to have an association with young men, particularly at colleges and universities. And so American football, as it begins to develop at the end of the 19th century, is basically a collegiate game. And professional football doesn't really emerge until the 1920s and even beyond that. So baseball becomes professional early on, and football and soccer remain kind of strictly amateur up until really the 20th century. So I think that's another important factor.
So the gridiron football at this point, which is played in colleges mainly, only gets codified towards the end of the century, I imagine.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it becomes a huge popular sport at the end of the 19th and early part of the 20th century, but it's an amateur game. It's college football, it's not professional.
You emphasize the importance of Pittsburgh, particularly the Scottish diaspora, in the growth of the game in this era, as well as the challenges that they face.
Yeah, I mean, I think immigrants were important, but I think Scots were particularly important in all sorts, almost all soccer communities in the United States at this time in the late 19th century. So Pittsburgh, a lot of the places that I talk about in my latest book also have a strong Scottish connection. I think it's partly because Scottish immigrants tended to form associations when they moved abroad. So they had these kind of a platform in which to organize soccer clubs out of. They had societies and community celebrations. They had a kind of a base that they could build on and incorporate soccer. Also, as soccer came to Scotland in the 1870s, it quickly became kind of the national game there and a very important part of Scottish identity. And so, of course, when they came to the US, they maintained that love of the game that had been building since the 1870s.
The Scottish Federation, the FA, I think was established 1873, and England was, of course, in 1863. So by the time they're coming to the United States, there's already like an established base of rules that they can follow. So that helps, I imagine, in the development once they get here and they establish clubs and competitions in cities.
Yep, exactly.
Reading your book, I learned that there was a first attempt in making the game professional in 1894. And this was led by baseball team owners and a conflict with another league that was founded earlier. Essentially, the ALPF against the AAPF. What can you say about this period?
Well, I think it says something about the popularity of soccer that the baseball owners took notice of this sport that was immensely popular, particularly on the East Coast of the United States in places like Boston, Philadelphia, New York, Fall River. And so they saw this as a potential revenue generator for them. Baseball is a spring to fall sport, and so they looking for some kind of professional sport that they could make money off of all year round. So baseball would have its season where they would make money, and then they wanted to create another professional league that would make money during the winter months when baseball was in the off season. And the natural choice would have been intercollegiate football, but because that was hugely popular, but that was an amateur game, and there was then, and I think for many people still down to the present day, there's a great deal of resistance to making college football professional. So they thought, okay, what kind of a code can we find? Intercollegiate football is not going to work, so maybe association football will work because we already see these teams and these leagues and these competitions that are attracting thousands of people to big matches. And so I think that was probably their primary motive, that they would be able to control professional sports. They would be able to have sporting revenue all year round. They made money when intercollegiate football games played in their stadiums, but the college football season, of course, was just in the fall. And so they had from, let's say, November to April or something where those stadiums were not necessarily empty, but they were not full or as full as maybe the baseball owners wanted it. So I think that was probably their thinking. It also came at a good time for the baseball owners because they were making money. They weren't facing any rivals. There had been kind of contentious squabbles and struggles between different leagues over the course of the 19th century or the second half of the 19th century in baseball. And so 1894 was a time when they felt like they had a clear field, so to speak, without any competitors in baseball, without any competitors in other sports. So it seemed like a great opportunity.
In the end, both leagues folded shortly thereafter due to, I imagine, poor organization and money and other factors. You also discuss the early steps of the women's game and a particular match in December 1893 between Colin Bonds and Bonnie Lasses. And you mentioned two pioneers, unrelated, Doris Clark and Helen Clark. What was their impact on the greater soccer game in general at that time?
I think that the match in 1893 in San Francisco was maybe, I mean, it didn't necessarily have a lasting impact because they played two games and then there wasn't another game, or I haven't been able to find any other women's games that have been documented, really until after the turn of the 20th century. So it wasn't like it sparked some great women flocking to play soccer in the United States. But I think it does reflect maybe two things. One is the popularity of soccer in San Francisco during that period. It was a sport that was, again, kind of growing in popularity. And the guy who ran the Central Park, the stadium there in the city, saw this as an opportunity to make money, to put on a kind of interesting and potentially, I wouldn't say controversial, but it had a bit of they had women's baseball games as well. So there was something about women playing sports that still kind of seemed a bit dangerous or a little bit kind of exciting in a way. And so I think that was part of it as well. But it also is, I think, a good illustration of how women's sports had begun to grow in the second half of the 19th century. We see soccer being played on some college campuses. We see other sports being played. We see women joining or creating cycling clubs. So it really is a sort of a sign of this broader participation of women in athletics, really for the first time in large numbers in the 19th century. I think Doris and Helen Clark are important just because they show us that even from the beginning of the game, really, especially in the early part of the 20th century, that women were taking on different roles as coaches, as referees, as soccer officials, that given an opportunity that women could and did fulfill those roles. There was nothing that, I mean, the only thing that was kind of keeping them from it was, I suppose, a certain amount of sexism. But I think they do illustrate that women were taking on those roles and were good at them.
As the world was engulfed in the First World War in the 20th century, in your book you discuss how the war slowed the development of the game in the States, yet the experience of the war helped to transition the game into the sporting landscape of the nation. Can you explain this further and why this post First War era is regarded as the golden age of the game in the United States?
I think it's important that there was a kind of a burst of activity at the end of the 19th century in the 1880s and 1890s, the formation of leagues and clubs and competitions really all around the US. And then around the turn of the 20th century, it kind of dropped off a little bit. Part of it had to do with the slowing of immigration, particularly from Great Britain during that period. It also had to do with just poor weather. So, for example, in Fall River, whole seasons were canceled because the weather was just too bad to play. And so that was kind of a lull around the turn of the 20th century. And then we have the visits of two English clubs in the early first decade of the 20th century, the Corinthians and the Pilgrims, and that kind of sparks a revival. And so in the 1910s, really from about 1905 to maybe 1915, you have again a kind of an upsurge, an uptick in the formation of clubs and competitions, again, in cities around the United States. And then the war happens, and a lot of players and administrators and officials are still immigrants. And so they go and sign up or they return home. They're often young men of military age. And so they go back and join the British Army or the Canadian Army or something like that. And so those leagues lose players, lose officials. And so the war kind of, like other places, really slows the development. But then I think there's two factors. One is the number of US players or US born soldiers who go to Europe to serve may have experienced soccer for the first time. In some ways, a lot like me, right? That I went to Europe and learned to love the game. And I think that happened to a lot of soldiers as well, that maybe they didn't have a lot of experience with soccer when they were at home, but then they saw how popular it was among the French, the Belgians, the British, the Australians, all those people played soccer during the war. And so US servicemen would have seen these games, would have maybe had some connection to these, international players. The US military and the YMCA actively encouraged US soldiers to play soccer. So that was another factor. And so I think the return of those soldiers now having seen soccer, maybe having played soccer, perhaps had a growing interest in the sport. Also, you had the return once again of British and Scottish immigrants to the States, so they could kind of, in some ways, pick up where they left off before the war. And so it really just kind of begins to go on an increase. The number of leagues, the number of teams, the number of entrants into the Challenge Cup. And then we get the formation of the American Soccer League in 1921, the first really major attempt to create a professional league since 1894. And that is a very successful enterprise for about a decade before it collapses. And it begins to attract players from around the world, some of them really top notch talents from places like England or Sweden or Norway, Scotland, of course. And so I think for a time, the ASL becomes as probably as good as maybe any league outside of England, I would say, during the 1920s.
With the newfound interest, How quickly is the ASL, the American Soccer League, established in 1921?
I mean, it's pretty quick. Thomas Cahill, who was involved in the founding of the U.S. Soccer Federation, he had been sort of dreaming of creating a professional league. And I think after the war, he saw this as an opportunity. So he was really the driving force behind the creation of the ASL. And as I said, I think he had had that in mind for quite some time. And I think he saw the end of the war in 1918 and the return of the U.S. soldiers and potentially international immigrants to the U.S. as well. That took place over 1919 primarily. So it was about a year and a half or two from the end of the war and the return of the soldiers to the launching of the American Soccer League. So I think that was a pretty quick turnaround. And we can also see, I think I cite the numbers, I don't know, remember them off the top of my head, but as I said, the National Challenge Cup, which is now the US Open Cup, the number of entrants in that competition grew from 1918, 1919, 1921. So you could kind of see that organic growth happening. And then with Cahill's organization and backing and the federation on board, that the ASL came together fairly quickly.
You also have a chapter on soccer in Massachusetts and the Holyoke Falcons, a team sponsored by the industrial textile company Far Alpaca. Can you discuss the importance of this story?
I use that as an example, again, of kind of different aspects which can be applied to other soccer communities in the United States during that period. So some of the common themes are, again, the importance of immigrant groups, particularly from the United Kingdom, and the popularity of soccer among those groups. Another important factor was the support, whether indirectly or directly, from corporations. So during the 1920s, a lot of companies they wanted to eliminate absenteeism, so get workers to show up for work. They wanted to prevent workers from drinking too much. They wanted to prevent workers from organizing unions, those sorts of things. And so one way they did this was by funding recreational activities for their workers. And that might include things like building a theater or sponsoring theatrical groups and singing groups, but it also included sports. And so a lot of these companies, directly or indirectly, like I said, because we don't have a lot of information about whether or not these companies were just giving money to these clubs, but they certainly allowed clubs to use their names, provided clubs with space and sometimes soccer fields or other kinds of cricket or baseball fields for these teams to play. So I think that's an important element to the broader history of the game during that period. And Massachusetts or Holyoke just provides a kind of detailed case study of that general process.
Ultimately, why was the ASL not sustainable? Was it because, as you said, soccer was regarded as an ethnic game? Was it the Great Depression, or were there other factors?
I think the two biggest factors were the Great Depression, which was in 1929, and the first iteration of the ASL collapsed in 1931, essentially. The other factor was a dispute over whether or not ASL clubs were going to participate in the National Cup competition. Basically, there was tension between the league and the federation involving the participation of ASL clubs in the federation's cup competition. So the ASL teams felt like the federation took too much money. It took time out of the playing schedule to have these matches. And so they wanted to either not play at all or enter into the tournament at a later stage. And the federation basically said that the ASL clubs attracted the most fans, and so that meant more money at the gate. And so the federation wanted the ASL teams to participate from the start, or at least from early rounds. And so this caused a rift. Eventually, some of the teams were thrown out of the federation. They formed another rival professional league. So I think those were the two biggest factors. The Great Depression, which obviously had incredible financial impact on the league, and then this infighting between the federation and the league, which caused essentially a schism. That's never a good sign and never a healthy place to be if you're a professional league, to be fighting with the national federation.
Looking on balance, why is this early history of the game important in understanding the evolution of the game until today?
I mean, one of the goals that I had for this book, as I mentioned kind of at the beginning, was that there have not been a lot. I mean, there have been more now, even since the book came out, but there had not been a lot of academic studies of the sport. And there is a pretty rich academic literature on soccer or football in other parts of the world, whether that's Italy or Spain or England or Argentina or Brazil. And so there's an entire body of soccer history, kind of global soccer history that exists. And the United States was kind of absent from that. I mean, a little bit of a mention here and there, but essentially the United States in some ways was not a part of this broader conversation. And so one of the things I wanted to do was to kind of write something that could be kind of an opening or opening a dialogue into this greater conversation about the history of soccer across the globe. And so it's meant to be kind of tentative and not, this is not the definitive work on the subject. It's more of a kind of an opening bid, so to speak, to kind of try to introduce people in the United States to the fact that we do have this incredibly rich history with soccer. It's not something that started in the 1970s with Pele or in the 1990s with MLS or, the 1990s with the women's national team. That in fact, our history is as deep and rich in many ways as any other country in the world. And so I wanted that to be known outside of the United States. And I wanted people in the United States to appreciate the depth and the richness of the history of soccer here.
Right. Most of the historical discussion is mostly about 1930, the 1950 win against England, and then you fast forward to the NASL with Pele, and yeah, that's more or less it. So this goes further back to the origins.
Yeah, I think online I found, I don't know if it's still there, and I won't necessarily say the organization, but they had a US soccer history timeline. And I think it cited maybe one of the, I can't remember exactly the details, but it cited one of the Native American descriptions as kind of an early originator. And then I can't remember, it had another one. I can't remember what it was. And then it went to 1930. And then from 1930, it went to 1950. So exactly as you're saying that, there were maybe one or two entries on this timeline before 1930, and then only one other one until 1950. So yeah, that's kind of what the landscape was like. And I think hopefully I show in the book that there was a lot more going on in terms of soccer history before 1930.
So, in closing, what is the legacy of this early history in the greater soccer culture of the United States today? Is there a linkage to the development of the game that we see today? And I think we somewhat touched up on it.
I mean, I think it's probably just to show again that we do have a rich history, that it isn't a has been, it was a sport played by immigrants, but it was not just an immigrant sport, that it was played by native born Americans, especially in places like St. Louis, from the end of the 19th century all the way through the 20th century. So I think the idea that soccer is a foreign game, that was only introduced much later, I think is false. And I hope that people today can read my book and read some of the work of other scholars and learn that, wow, this isn't something that just appeared here again in the 1970s or in 1950 or whatever, that in fact it's been here for quite a long time. And so I think that, I hope at least that that's part of the contribution of the book. And maybe just this idea again that we think about baseball as having this long, interesting history and other sports as well. And I want soccer to be seen as part of this US sport history, really, from an early stage.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our contact information and the link to your book is listed on the blog and podcast uploads. And I would urge everyone to read this book. There's a lot of stories that most fans don't know about. So I encourage everyone to read this book. So thank you once again, and hope to continue these discussions on soccer history in the United States.
Thank you very much.